Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about built-in functions. We're going to look at some that you'll need. We're going to explain syntax and some other basic terminology. And then we're going to look at a few of them. There's a bunch that we will not have time to cover in class that you will need. We're going to try to cover as many of the essentials as possible, but you will have to look up your own functions, figure out things that you'll need to try and not reinvent the wheel. So, a quick overview. We're going to look at just what a function is. We look at how we use them, why we use them, why these matter, why can't we just write code that does what we want it to, yada yada. We're going to look at what it means to call a function. It's a word you've heard me use in class and in lectures before. We're going to look at exactly what that means. We're going to look at syntax. We're going to look at how a function call is written. We're going to look at parameters and arguments. These are terms you'll hear used interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. So we're going to take some time and we're going to explain what these mean. Return values, one last bit of information. This is an essential part of functions. This is what gives them their power. So we're going to look at what a return value is and how we take advantage of them. And then lastly, we're going to look at some essential functions that you're going to need. So just for the sake of this overview, we're going to focus on terminology and syntax, and then in following lectures, we'll look at some essential functions. So, what is a function? Well, in the same way that you could think of a variable as a box for a single piece of data, you can think of a function as a box or a container for a single piece of code. This code is designed to accomplish exactly one task, whether it be printing something to the screen, taking the sum of a group of numbers, taking a list of things and adding other things onto it, and so on and so forth. I don't even want to know how many built-in functions there are. Thousands, possibly more, most likely. So there are an incredible number of them, and then you can bring in external resources that add even more functions to your program. So again, a function you could think of as a container for a single piece of reusable code. Think of it like a button. So, functions can take some input and they may produce some output. Neither of these are required. Some functions take no input, but they give you an output. Some functions go the other way around. They just produce some kind of output. It varies by function, and that is going to determine exactly how we call the function. So, functions are part of the core principle of dry code, and this is something I'm going to mention throughout the semester going forward. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. Generally speaking, if you have some kind of code that you are doing more than once, you're doing exactly the same more than once, even if it's to different variables, you could be breaking this off into its own block of code instead. You're probably if you are repeating yourself, you are doing something wrong. So, this is one of the main reasons we use functions. It's a reason why we use a bunch of other things as well, but we'll get to those when we get to them. So, what do we mean when we say call a function? To call a function is to invoke it, to tell your interpreter or whatever software you're using, whatever language you're using, because functions are everywhere in every major language. You are telling it, hey, you know this piece of code here with this name? I want you to use that. I want you to invoke this and run its code. Stop right here, run this code, and return back to this when it's done. So that is what we mean by calling a function. We are telling Python to run the code contained in the function. Coming down to syntax, generally speaking, calling a function is just a matter of writing its name, open parenthesis, close parenthesis. If you do not include the parentheses, then Python's not going to know you're trying to call a function, or it's going to get confused. So when you look at the syntax of a function, different functions are going to have a different number of arguments. So no arguments is just an empty pair of parentheses. A single argument is you just put that in its inside the parentheses. Think like the print function. That we were using one argument. Some of you were using more than one. And if you have two, you just separate them by commas. If you have any number of arguments, again, separate with commas. There is an order to how you must enter your arguments. Speaking of arguments, what do we mean by arguments versus parameters? These are two terms you'll hear interchangeably. Other languages might even have different words for them. But when we talk about an argument, that is part of a function call. That is the value that you are giving. So when you called print and gave it message in your first assignment, message was the argument that you gave to the print function when you called it. On the other hand, parameters are a product of function definition. These tell us what arguments are required. So print asks for a string. That string, I don't remember its name. I don't pay attention to the names of a lot of functions, which is not necessarily a great thing, but I just know the order and I know the nature of the data it's asking for. I think it's just text or something along those lines, or OBJ. But that is a string, or it's asking for an object of any type. Because if you recall, if you just gave print an integer and nothing else, it would print that integer as if it were a string. So print can take a string. It could take an int, a float, a bool, as long as you don't try to combine types like I showed you. If you need to combine types, then you need to make sure that they are of the same type. If you are taking more than one variable and you want them to be printed, you need to make sure that they are all strings. So that is the difference between a parameter and an argument. A parameter tells you what you need. An argument is you giving the function what it needs. And if your arguments are wrong, Python is not going to hesitate to yell at you and explain to you what you have done wrong. And the last term we want to talk about here is a return value. Every function has the possibility of ending with a return statement. All you'll see is the word return followed by some value. Now what this does is this sends data back to the calling function. So think about when we were using int and float and str. We were setting variables equal to a call to that function. So what's happening is we're creating a variable that calls a function. Let's say, for example, int. Int takes some input. It extracts an integer from that input, and it returns that integer. So that integer comes out of the int function, and then it goes into our variable. And that is how returns work. Most languages only allow for one return value. If you want to return more than one thing, then you would have to create some kind of collection type, or some other more complex piece of data to send back as a return value. Some languages do allow for multiple return values. Python ain't one of them. You're going to need to figure out how to get everything you need to send back in one variable. So that is going to cover our lecture materials. A term you have actually, before we stop, a term you have heard me state, and a term you have seen in these lecture slides a couple times, is atomic values. What are atomic values? These are, so we describe something that cannot be divided into smaller pieces as being atomic. An integer is an atomic value. A string is an atomic value. If you try to break it up into smaller pieces, these lose their meaning. So that is what we mean by an atomic value. A list is not atomic. A dictionary is not atomic. But any single variable, that is atomic. So I want that to be clear in your heads going forward. After this, we're going to talk about some essential functions. We will cover each one in a bite-sized lecture. Starting with the next one, we're going to look a little closer at the print function. There are some other features of it that you have not yet seen. So, stay tuned for that.